Hey guys! Tonight we step into a smoke-filled medieval kitchen to uncover 15 dishes that'll leave you either in awe or running for the hills. From pottage so thick it clings to your teeth, to ash cakes hard as stone, and even the oddities that only surface during the harshest famines. You'll be surprised to learn which dishes were both dirt cheap and life-saving, and which were so rare the entire village would fight over them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Don't forget to share where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine stepping into the humble kitchen of a medieval village, the wooden roof beams dimly lit, torchlight dancing on stone walls, and a haze of smoke drifting through the air like a golden mist. At the center of the room sits a massive cast-iron cauldron pottage, the everlasting pottage, the very first of our 15 survival dishes, gently bubbling on a clay hearth. The rim of the pot curves inward, as frothy bubbles rise and pop with a soft hiss, releasing the faint yeasty aroma of sweet potatoes, the earthy tang of cabbage, and a whisper of smoldering wood smoke. Each thick spoonful, a hearty blend of humble grains and foraged vegetables, does more than warm your body. It tells the proud story of peasant ingenuity, how they transformed the simplest ingredients into sustained nourishment through long days of hardship. At its heart, pottage is simply a thick porridge born of necessity. When white wheat and rice were luxury items for nobles and clerics, peasants made do with the cheapest grains, usually rye, oats, or barley. Unhulled and only lightly rinsed, these grains were simmered until they collapsed into a rich, gloopy mash. Into this base they tossed whatever vegetables remained: hardened turnips, pungent onions, wilted cabbage, even the occasional carrot or handful of peas when fortune smiled. Rather than cooking fresh batches each meal, they adopted a set-it-and-forget-it approach. Keep the stew simmering day after day, ladle out portions at mealtimes, then top up with new ingredients as available. This saved precious fuel and prevented waste. Excavations of rural English villages show that a pottage pot typically lasted at least 4 days before a new batch was started. And during the bitterest winters, some pots stayed going for a full week. Pottage embodies the medieval ethos of sustainable eating. A landmark era for this tradition was the Great Famine of 1315-1317, when white wheat vanished from fields, and rye-based pottage became the last lifeline for millions across Europe. Without it, survival was nearly impossible. Yet pottage also carried an unexpected religious role. Some monasteries served pottage as their sole Lenten fast meal. Under the rule of Saint Benedict, 529 AD, monks were permitted only one pottage-based repast on Ash Wednesday, viewed as a humble offering. Despite its simplicity, pottage represented the principles of waste not and spiritual humility that defined monastic life. Picture scooping a spoonful of this stew. The initial warmth and grainy sweetness give way to the faint bite of cabbage and earthiness of root vegetables, finishing on a whisper of wild herbs. While it may evoke modern oatmeal with brown sugar, pottage is deeper, richer, and earthier, almost like a tapestry of survival itself. Scholars debate how often peasants truly refreshed their pottage. One view holds that they cooked a fresh pot daily, adding new ingredients as if reheating modern leftovers. Another argues they literally kept one continual pot alive, resulting in a stew with an ever-evolving, aged flavor, sometimes overwhelmingly musty, yet still revered as a communal banquet. For medieval farmers, pottage was far more than a dish. It was a philosophy. One pot to feed the week. Villagers organized kitchen watches, taking turns tending the fire, skimming off foam, and ensuring the stew never boiled over or went cold, safeguarding both food and fellowship. Meanwhile, nobles could not soil their silver bowls with such a coarse fare. Instead, they imported spices, cardamom, cinnamon, nutmeg from the east, stirred in wine, and even shredded rabbit meat to transform pottage into a perpetual royal buffet. At King Edward's court, late 13th century England, banquet record describe a soupiroir, a grand evening feast where pottage was ladled from silver tureens and dusted with pricey pepper as a ceremonial starter. Yet you might be surprised. Even aristocrats sometimes preserved a common pottage pot in the background for lean seasons, using family recipes to elevate the humble stew. In Madame Thérèse's 14th century French cookbook, she layers cream and agar on top of pottage to present it as a dessert proof that creativity thrived even in adversity. Now you see, pottage is not merely soldier's gruel, but a bridge between poverty and opulence. Its straightforward recipe belies a storied history. It helped people endure famine, war, plague, and the biting cold of medieval Europe. So, would you dare taste that ancient stew? In the next segment, we'll explore the hard-as-rock dark breads that could double as self-defense weapons. But first, ask yourself, could you consume 2 to 3 pints of pottage daily without complaint? That is the secret to understanding how medieval peasants thrived on their endless pot. Remember, pottage, the endless stewess, not just food. It is living history, a testament to innovation in hardship, and proof that survival often depends on a single simmering pot. The true journey into medieval cuisine begins here. After the first dish, pottage, the endless stew, the second staple you'll encounter on our medieval journey, is rye bread, better known as the rock-solid loaf. If pottage is the nourishing liquid that sustains the body, rye bread is the dense carbohydrate fortress that holds a peasant's strength together through long days of labor. Picture this. After a morning spent milking oxen and ploughing fields, your body aching from sun and sweat, you wrap a thick slice of rye bread in your hand, an unwieldy chunk of crusty, cold, dark dough. You bite down, and your teeth creak and groan against its hardness. This is no soft white loaf. It's heavy, dry, and unyielding. To eat it, you must dunk it quickly into a bowl of steaming pottage, or soak it in a cup of cheap wine just to soften it enough to chew. In medieval northern Europe, rye or barley was the only grain hardy enough to thrive in poor soil and harsh climate. Wheat white enough for fine pastry was reserved for royalty and monasteries. After harvest, villagers hauled their sacks of rye to the lord's mill. The miller charged a hefty milling fee, often half the flour produced, which forced peasants to stretch their share by mixing in cheaper fillers. Ground beans, acorn meal, even powdered tree bark. Once a week, the entire village gathered at the communal stone oven, often an arched brick vault in the village common stove, bake their loaves. Each family received its own dense, charcoal brown loaf to take home for the next 7 days. By the end of the week, those loaves were as unbreakable as paving stones. Villagers needed knives to shave off scorched crust or chop the loaf into manageable chunks, then reheat them over red coals to make them edible again. The crackling sound of that crust felt more like chiseling masonry than slicing bread. Worse still, rye bread often harbored mold or the toxic fungus ergot. Ergot growing on rye could cause St. Anthony's fire-violent seizures, terrifying hallucinations, and even death. Entire villages were known to fall prey to mass outbreaks of convulsions and delirium, as if an unseen inferno raged through their homes. Yet, despite these hardships, rye bread remained indispensable. It supplied over 60% of a peasant's daily calories. A single slice, no matter how tough, could stave off hunger long enough to finish that afternoon's labor, or make it through another meager supper. In stark contrast, the nobility enjoyed a very different loaf. At every manor house and castle, a private bakehouse turned out pure white wheat bread, leavened naturally with spring water and starter dough. These loaves were soft, golden-crusted, and fragrantly yeasty, eaten fresh from the oven without need for soaking or reheating. Archaeobotanical studies confirm that traces of rye bread appear in commoner graves fragments preserved in soil, whereas white wheat bread shows up only in royal tombs and monastic sites. This underscores the fact that rye bread was the daily staff of life for peasants, while white bread symbolized status and purity. Historians still debate whether peasants ate rye bread by necessity forced by poverty, or grew to prefer its hearty flavor. One camp argues they had no choice. The other insists its high fiber content and sustaining qualities made it a sustaining staple that became familiar, even welcome. A little-known regional twist comes from Brittany in France, where bakers added ground hazelnut shells to their rye dough, imparting a faint, nutty aroma that slightly sweetened the loaf. This subtle innovation made Breton rye bread a prized local specialty, proving that even the toughest loaf could be elevated with a creative touch. In short, that rock-hard rye loaf was the nutritional bulwark that shielded peasants from starvation. A single slice might literally keep you alive until the next harvest or the Lord's next generosity. Imagine biting into that crust on a bitter winter morning, despite the pain. The simple act of mastication brought a surge of warmth and community solidarity. Rye bread, the second dish in our medieval feast, embodies the principle, eat to live, live to work, so thoroughly that it became more than food. It was a bulwark of survival and an icon of peasant resilience. Next, we'll explore medieval fast food. Salted herring transported from coastal fisheries straight into inland villages to feed generations. Prepare your senses for its briny punch and pungent aroma. Following the chain of survival foods in the Middle Ages, after the warming pottage and the steadfast rye bread, we arrive at the third dish, gruel, thin survival porridge. If pottage and bread help you stay alive, gruel is the true last resort, reserved for the darkest hours when almost nothing remains in storage. Imagine this: a bitterly cold day, snow piled thick against the window, the hearth long since gone cold for lack of firewood. You have only a handful of grain scraps, broken oats, shriveled barley, or even a few pebbly rice kernel sand, a bucket of plain water. In a pitch-dark kitchen, you pour a few spoonfuls of grain into an earthenware pot, add 2 to 3 times as much water, set it on damp straw, and let it simmer gently. When the grains are just soft enough, but the liquid remains too watery to call it a soup, you have gruel, a cup of porridge that is warm enough and nourishing enough. Gruel's purpose is not flavor. One careful sip, with its bland grain taste and smoky aroma of drying straw, is enough to stave off faintness from hunger. In the leanest months' brutal winters, or after a failed harvest, preparing gruel is a village ritual. The pot set on 3 damp straw bundles, the discreet crackle of embers beneath. The wealthier might add coarse salt, stale wine, or dried herbs plucked from untended hedgerows. The poorest have nothing but water and the leftover grains. Some monasteries even regard gruel as the strict Lenten fare. Under the rule of Saint Benedict, a monk on Ash Wednesday or Christmas Eve would receive only a single gruel meal, a ritual purification of the flesh and a testament to humility. Picture the tolling bell as a spoon dips into the thin porridge, a solemn rite in the hushed scriptorium. Medically, medieval doctors often prescribed gruel for the convalescent, new mothers, and weaning infants, praising its ease of digestion for weakened stomachs. Tragically, many newborns, deprived of sufficient mother's milk, were fed gruel from birth, contributing to high infant mortality. Period medical texts even call gruel a thin restorative, providing energy but lacking true nutrition. Historians still debate whether over-reliance on gruel prolonged cycles of malnutrition, weakening entire peasant lineages. One little-known detail: the Monkford Chronicle in England records a harsh gruel trial. Novice monks seeking admission had to subsist on nothing but gruel for 3 days, both a test of endurance and a proof that gruel was the spiritual survival medicine essential to monastic life. You can almost feel the austerity of that ordeal, yet also see how central thin porridge was to cloistered existence. Gruel stands between having food and starving to death. In the medieval imagination, nothing was more dreadful than watching the pottage pot run dry, the bread turn rock hard, and being left only with a bucket of water and a few spoonfuls of grain. Gruel is the fragile barrier against death by hunger. A single spoonful buys you another breath, another day's labor, however tenuous. Think of the pungent aroma of that watery porridge, the smoky drift of straw, and the soft crackle as the pot bottom meets the coals. You wonder, could you survive 3 days on nothing but gruel? It awakens the most fundamental instinct: eat to live, live to await the next harvest. In the world of the Middle Ages, gruel is more than food. It is proof of extraordinary human adaptability. No matter how harsh the conditions, people found ways to cook a few stray grains, kindle a spark of warmth, and maintain hope for a more plentiful tomorrow. When pottage and bread fail, gruel appears to pull us back from the brink of starvation. Are you ready for the next medieval fast food salted herring? Prepare yourself for its briny punch and a true test of your senses. Following your escape from starvation with gruel, the thin survival porridge, the fourth staple in the medieval menu is the humble root. Turnips and rutabagas, the strong roots in barren soil. When grain grew so scarce you had to count every kernel. These hardy roots emerged as the village's saviour. Picture a desolate field, cracked and nutrient poor, yet beneath that hard earth, turnips and rutabagas swell and thrive. A single seed can yield dozens of pounds of roots in just a few months. Now these roots become your mobile food warehouse. You grab an axe, dig them up, chop them into chunks, and toss them into your simmering pottage or boil them alone in water with a pinch of salt. If you're fortunate enough to have a scrap of pork, fat or lard, it cuts through the earthy flavour, making them more palatable. During the bitter winter, villagers dig storage pits in the yard, lining them with straw and covering with cloth to keep the roots fresh for months. In the biting cold, you wrap yourself in a cloak, hold a plump turnip in your hand, bite in, taste the faint sweetness of the soil. It warms your throat just enough to stave off freezing hunger. But these roots are more than mere survival food. They are medicine too. Rutabaga juice is prescribed for coughs and sore throats, while a mash of turnip pulp pressed onto wounds fights infection. Folk medicine witches pass down tales that turnips can ward off evil spirits and protect crops from storms. Imagine an old woman beneath a stand of oaks, clutching a turnip and whispering charms to keep her barley from withering, an image both mystical and rustic. Not everyone, however, praises the turnip. Some modern voices warn that eating turnips long-term leads to vitamin C deficiency and scurvy. Contemporary analyses of excavated roots reveal only trace amounts of vitamins. Meanwhile, medieval physicians heatedly debate whether these roots truly possess miraculous properties, or simply serve as a meagre stopgap during famine. A little-known detail. In Brittany, France, villagers once made a turnip-based wine, cooking down preserves of turnip, fermenting them into a refreshing winter drink. The 3-day winter festival featured ribbon dances around giant turnip piles, celebrating and praying for a bountiful harvest. Lanterns carved from turnip skins, glowing with carved smiles, lit up the cold nights. Though primitive, turnips and rutabagas were the peasants' bedside staple in the Middle Ages. They demonstrate the ingenious use of wild plants to sustain an entire community through blizzards and drought. So the next time you bite into a bland boiled turnip, remember, these robust roots kept countless generations from succumbing to hunger and freezing cold. Continuing the chain of survival foods in the Middle Ages, after turnips and thin porridge, the fifth dish is the pair that's stinky but priceless: cabbage and onions. If you thought only hardy roots mattered, the broad cabbage leaves and slender onion stalks were a peasant's everyday lifeline, despite their challenging aromas. Imagine a small garden plot lined with rows of plump cabbages, their dark green heads weighing up to 15 kilograms each. Farmers peel away the outer leaves one by one, dropping them into their bubbling pottage or stewing them with stale bread. Each cabbage leaf adds crunch, a hint of sweetness, and most importantly bulk to fill hungry bellies. Nearby, onions and scallions weave through every row, thriving in the cold and warding off pests with their sharp scent. The prick of onion juice on your fingers reminds you these aren't just seasonings, they're indispensable medicines. Cabbage also became sauerkraut's ancestor, young leaves shredded, salted, and tightly packed in wooden barrels to ferment naturally. You can almost hear the gentle hiss of carbon dioxide escaping, smell the tart tang of lactic acid. Sauerkraut not only brightened bland diets, but supplied precious vitamin C to prevent scurvy during long winter months when fresh greens were non-existent. Open a crock of sauerkraut and the soft pop of its lid, followed by that slightly sour perfume, evokes the era's frigid larders. Onion, no less pungent, was prized as a warming remedy. Medieval peasants squeezed onion juice with honey and wine into jars to soothe coughs and soothe sore throats. Picture a village healer by the hearth, crushing onions by candlelight, mixing the pulp with thick honey in a clay jar, smoke curling around her as she dispenses spoonfuls of this simple cough syrup. Some monasteries even tucked raw onion slices into their monks' boots in winter, believing the heat would drive off the chill from their feet. Yet cabbage and onion earned the nickname gas offenders. Their notorious odour and inevitable belches drove dining companions away. Church authorities sometimes banned cabbage at major feast days, fearing it would disrupt the solemnity of the ceremonies. You can imagine a priest raising his chalice of sacramental wine, turning away at the slightest whiff of sauerkraut nearby. Historians still debate, did medieval villagers grow little else out of laziness, Or did they recognize that cabbage and onions were true survival secrets? Archaeological surveys show that many peasant homesteads reserved an entire corner of their garden exclusively for cabbages and onions, proof of their irreplaceable role in daily meals. One little known detail. In Alsace, France, there was an annual cabbage and onion festival in midwinter. Villagers would bring their best crocks of sauerkraut to compete, argue over fermentation recipes, then dance around a ribbon-wrapped cabbage head under cold stars. They exchanged seeds, salting tips, and storage advice, community solidarity in the face of freezing hardship. Though cabbage and onions test the nose, they are a peasant's nutritional fortress. So the next time you taste a tangy forkful of sauerkraut or sip a warming broth scented with onions, remember that this stinky duo kept generations of farmers alive through blizzards, droughts, and disease in the harsh Middle Ages. Following our journey through survival foods, the sixth staple in the medieval diet is the humble bean, the true protein hero. In a world where meat was banned on many holy days, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 strictly forbade flesh during Lent, peas, lentils, and fava beans became the indispensable vegetarian meat that fed millions of laborers. Picture bundles of garden peas, lentils, and broad beans drying in the autumn sun after harvest. When mealtime came, peasants would soak the beans overnight to rehydrate them, then simmer them in a clay pot over a straw fire until tender. Once soft, the beans were mashed or ground into a thick paste, seasoned with a pinch of coarse sea salt or sprigs of wild herbs to mask the earthy flavor. This pulse-based porridge not only filled empty stomachs, but also supplied lysine and fiber-essential nutrients to maintain muscle strength and healthy bones through long days in the fields. Monastic records from the 13th century note that each monk received about 1.5 liters of mashed beans per day during Lent, often accompanied by a fragment of hard barley bread. You can almost hear the metal spoons scraping against the pottery bowl and smell the faintly pungent steam rising as they consumed their meatless meat after morning prayers. A little-known tradition from the Champagne region in France adds a dash of romance. Each year, villagers held a bean-beating contest after the harvest festival. Young men and women raced to pound beans most skillfully, with the winner earning the right to a private courtship with their secret beloved. Historians still debate whether beans alone provided enough complete protein and essential fats for heavy labor. One camp argues that beans are rich in lysine, fiber, and manganese, vital for energy metabolism. Critics point out that pulses lack vitamin B12 and omega-3 fatty acids, which could lead to long-term nutritional deficiencies if beans formed the sole protein source. Regardless, there's no denying that beans and pulses formed the nutritional backbone of medieval society. A simple bowl of mashed beans kept bodies strong and communities working through famines, floods, and disease. When you taste that earthy, hearty flavor today, remember that these tiny seeds once stood as the pillars of strength for an entire civilization. Continuing our journey through medieval survival foods, the seventh item on our list is ash caith's ultimate survival trick, when every other food source has been exhausted. If even the last spoons of rancid pottage remain and rock-hard bread can only serve as a makeshift weapon for your teeth, then ash cake is the final resort, born in the midst of the bloody, famine-stricken Great European Disaster of 1317. Picture a bitter winter's day with snow piling against the window and storerooms completely bare. Fields have been stripped of turnips. Corn and sweet potatoes failed under drought. A farmer looks around and sees only the ashes from the hearth remnants of the last fire. In desperation, they gather stale breadcrumbs, stray grains, even bits of dry bark, and mix everything with cold water into a stiff dough. Forming the cakes is no less laborious. The dough is rolled out paper, thin about a spoon's length, and a thumb's width, and laid atop still glowing embers in the clay oven. Ash is sprinkled on top, burning into a dull, dusty crust that sizzles as steam rises. The cakes cook in just a few minutes, but can be eaten only once. Before eating, you must brush off the loose ash by hand, wiping each piece 2 or 3 times to avoid swallowing gritty lumps. Ash cakes are recorded in rural chronicles from England and France. During the famine of 1317, villagers wrote, It was a struggle just to mix enough ash with the crumbling scraps. The smell of burning wood lingered in every corner. Ash cake was the last food when placed in the mouth. You tasted only dry ash. But it kept us from starving. A curious detail appears in a Normandy village journal, the so-called ghost ash cake. Ash collected from the final wood fire was saved for the next lean season, believed to carry a hunger-saving spirit. Villagers would layer this ash in pits, ferment the dough in reverse fashion, and bake a second batch of ash cakes when the drought returned. The origin of ash cake remains debated among scholars. One school argues it evolved from the Roman panis focaciusa, thin flatbread baked on hot stones, and was adapted by Germanic descendants. Another insists ash cake was a purely local invention, a resourceful use of kitchen ashes with no classical precedent. Whatever its roots, ash cake emerged from sheer necessity, a testament to medieval adaptability. Nutritionally, ash cake offers virtually nothing beyond dirty calories from ash and grain scraps. Yet in times of dire hunger, 100-200 calories from a single ash cake could buy you a few more hours of life. Wealthier households might mix in leftover barley or black bean hulls to improve binding and slightly mask the harsh taste. It was unrelenting hunger that gave birth to ash cake. It mirrors the suffering of the peasantry, while showcasing humanity's creative resilience, transforming the most worthless remnant into a final source of sustenance. Ash cake reminds us that even at the brink of starvation, people find ways to survive when all seems lost. So when you hear about medieval ash cake, the ultimate survival trick, imagine the lingering smell of soot, the bitter tang of burnt ash, and the thin, rigid cake dusted in grey ash being dusted off again, only to be swallowed in hopes of making it through until morning. It is a brutal yet extraordinary portrait of human endurance amid the great famine of Europe. Continuing our survey of survival foods in the bleak Middle Ages, the 8th entry on our list of 15 is salted herring, the true medieval fast food, ready to grab and eat on the go, whether during Lent or on any meat-forbidden Friday. If yesterday we discussed ash cakes born of desperation, today imagine yourself tearing into a salty bit of salted herring, clutching a cold slice of bread or dipping it into steaming pottage. This was the fast food of 8 or 9 centuries ago. Picture yourself aboard a rough wooden fishing vessel in the North Sea in the autumn of 1300, waves tossing the boat, sailors hauling nets, scooping up mounds of fresh herring, gutting them and layering them in barrels with thick packing of saltfish, salt, fish, salt until full. Each barrel was tightly sealed, bound with ropes, and even labelled with the catch date, location, and the owner responsible, ensuring quality control. Thanks to the powerful Hanseatic League, millions of these barrels shipped from ports like Bergen, Lübeck and Rostock all over Central Europe, travelling hundreds of miles by sea and river to reach farmers and craftsmen in far-flung inland communities. In England, Edward II's Lenten Ordinance of 1321 required every working-age man to pay his weekly and Lenten tax in barrels of salted herring instead of coin. The town of Great Yarmouth became the epicenter of herring salting, boasting a dedicated herring quarter where salters worked behind curtained stalls. Locals claimed the pungent aroma banished even the strongest linen scents. A single stroll down the street guaranteed your cloak would carry the briny tang of the sea. But more than a stench, salted herring shaped medieval cuisine and economy. No ovens, pans, or elaborate hearths were needed. Just a slice of fish the size of your palm, dipped in warm water or lightly steeped in cheap red wine to soften the flesh and tame the salt. For the masons building castles, the smiths hammering iron, or even the monks observing their Lenten fast, a piece of salted herring with a sip of wine or a slab of coarse rye bread was the perfect portable meal packed with protein, fat, and electrolytes to sustain them through the workday or the midday sermon. Maritime archaeologists and economic historians still debate actual consumption levels. Some point to Baltic catch records estimating hundreds of millions of herring hauled each year enough to feed 1 million mouths across Europe, while customs ledgers sometimes report only modest shipments by barrel or sack. Did salted herring dominate everyday diets, or was it reserved mainly for Lenten observance and Friday abstinence, with pottage, bread and vegetables otherwise filling tables? Culinary historians remain divided. One camp sees herring as the life-saving staple that staved off famine, while another argues that in rural settings it was more seasonal or ritual than routine. Church law also propelled herring's popularity. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, clerics banned flesh meat on numerous holy days, especially during Lent, forcing the faithful to find substitutes. Herring small, oily, rich in omega-3s, easily preserved and shipped became the preeminent meat of the fish. 13th century monastic records note that every friar received a portion of salted herring and a slice of black bread for lunch during Lent, framing it as both nourishment and penance. Salted herring trade spawned long-distance routes. From northern ports, barrels travelled upstream on river barges, then by horse, drawn carts into the heart of France, Germany, even northern Italy and the Alps, and as far as Vienna. Though tolls and checkpoints abounded, herring's preservation resilience meant spoilage was rare even after weeks in transit. In many regions, tolls were paid in fish rather than coin, and herring itself functioned as a local currency. A little-known custom survives in coastal Pomerania, the herring wedding. When a young man became engaged, villagers would strap a barrel of salted herring to the shafts of the wedding wagon and parade it through the lanes, scattering salt on the road as a blessing of plenty for the new household. Lacking a barrel meant bad luck, so this ritual persisted for generations as a beloved local legend. Culinarily, herring sometimes appeared in herring pie, a baked crust of barley and acorn meal filled with salted herring and onions served at rural feasts or urban banquets in London. Yet for peasants, a simple herring dipped in coarse vinegar, made from wild apples, or a squeeze of lemon was enough. The brine's salt, the vinegar's tang, and the fish's own oil provided warmth and sustenance. Paleobotanical analyses of medieval herring barrels unearthed in Denmark even revealed traces of fennel seed, dillweed, and bay leaf evidence that fishermen experimented with herbs to enliven the flavour. Those aromatic sprigs rendered each bite of salted herring dripping with natural fish oil a humble gourmet treat, proof that necessity inspired ingenuity. Legend credited salted herring with curing leprosy. Itinerant healers along medieval trade routes prescribed vinegary herring brine for afflicted patients, believing salt's preservative power and acidity could purge toxins and cool hot humours. Though modern science has yet to validate such remedies, hundreds of folk medical manuscripts attest to herring's reputed benefits for joint swelling and skin ailments. Not everyone relished the smell or taste, of course. Those accustomed to fresh bread or mild pottage sometimes recoiled. Several medieval church edicts even banned herring in grand festivals to preserve solemn dignity. Scholars debate whether herring's prevalence stemmed more from religious stricture censuring meat abstinentia from pragmatic preservation and commerce. Whatever the reason, salted herring remains the most vivid illustration of medieval food preservation and long-distance trade. From brine-packed barrels shivering on icy docks to the mackerel-salted fillets steaming beside a pot of pottage, herring bridged sea and land, merchants and peasants, monks and masons in a world of scarcity yet unbounded creativity. The next time you taste a salty herring fillet, remember that behind each morsel lies a vast network of trade agreements, ecclesiastical laws, and the indomitable spirit of medieval people. After the 8th dish salted herring, the true medieval fast food with its briny taste carrying you through Lenten hunger and meatless Fridays, it's time to move on to the 9th survival staple in our 15-dish journey, beer and black bread, the immortal duo. You've just chewed a bite of salty herring. Now imagine a cloudy mug of ale on a rough wooden table, beside it a thick slice of coarse rye bread, briefly dipped until soft enough to bite. This pairing balances liquid and solid, salty and mild and, most importantly, is safer than, well water. Your germ-killing drink. In the Middle Ages, drinking straight well water was like inviting bacteria into your body, so ale became the most popular beverage. According to the rule of St. Fortis, Benedict, circa 525 AD, monks were only permitted to drink ale brewed within the monastery, avoiding stronger spirits. This regulation not only kept them alert for prayer, but also promoted brewing techniques, boiling water, and fermenting malt that eliminated harmful microbes. Commoners quickly followed suit, brewing small ale, with only 1-3% alcohol enough to kill germs without causing drunkenness. Ale was distributed to every family member, even children, as a kind of nutritional water. The image of toddlers holding clay cups and sipping cool ale became ingrained in rural culture. Instead of cloudy well water, children drank ale to stave off diarrhea and disease. Black breeder, rock-hard loaf. If ale was the life-saving liquid, black bread formed the skeletal framework of the meal. The dough used rye or barley mill ground at the Lord's mill often, mixed with crushed beans, oak husks, or tree bark to stretch expensive white flour. Once a week, the village communal oven was fired up. The resulting loaves were heavy, dry, and retained their shape for days. At mealtime, villagers cut thick slices and quickly dunked them into the frothing ale. You'd hear a sizzling sound as the crust absorbed the liquid, the slice softening on your tongue, the aroma of molten yeast mingling with a faint char from the crust. Black bread provided slow-release carbohydrates to keep you full, while the ale replenished fluids and a bit of natural sugar to ward off fatigue during a long workday. Scholarly debate. Still, scholars and scientists debate whether medieval ale truly was safer than well water. Proponents argue that boiling during brewing removed most bacteria, and that natural yeast and hops added antibacterial properties. Critics counter that the source water from wells and ponds was still polluted, and that yeast and hops only provided limited protection. To date, no biochemical evidence conclusively settles the matter, yet ale remains regarded as the safest drink within reach. Customs and festivals. The ale and bread meal appeared daily, but also featured in seasonal festivals, weddings, and memorials. In many monasteries, Lammas Day was celebrated by distributing monastery bread and beer to the poor, in the spirit of the rule of Saint Benedict. In Scotland, the tradition called Feiliamach, the malt beer festival, lives on. Each family presents their home brew, shares recipes and toasts to a prosperous new year. Nutrition and energy. A 200g slice of black bread provided roughly 400 kilocalories, while a small mug of ale, tilde 350 milliliters, added about 150 kilocalories plus minerals from the malt. With those 550 kilocalories, a manual labourer could easily sustain themselves throughout the workday, while avoiding dehydration or electrolyte imbalance. Without the bread and beer combo, cold could cause muscle cramps, and prolonged hunger would bring exhaustion and illness. A South German tale. One little-known tradition. In parts of southern Germany, some villages bathed children in diluted beer instead of water, believing the yeast and natural acids would disinfect the skin and prevent infection. Picture rosy toddlers splashing in wooden tubs amid hearth smoke, the sweet scent of malt, a curious yet comforting folk custom known as the malt bath, connecting past and present. Today, even with clean water and diverse foods, you can still spot this immortal duo in craft beer pubs paired with hearty toasted bread. The cloudy ale, the toasty loaf, and the old saying beer is safer than water inspire modern chefs and brewers to recreate medieval flavour, honouring our ancestors' struggle to survive. So we've explored the ninth dish: beer and bread. Despite hardship and religious strictures, people found a way to turn molten dough into a portable feast, nourishing both body and spirit for centuries. Get ready for the 10th dish, the Harvest Festival, where love and food mingle by candlelight and moonlit dances. Following that humble mug of ale and hearty slice of black bread, we now arrive at the sweet interlude of our medieval feast, with item number 10, cider and mead, the noble sweets. These drinks did more than soothe parched throats after a hard day's labour. They symbolised ceremony, status, and the terroir of orchard and apiary, enjoyed by nobles, clerics, and villagers alike for centuries. Imagine the rolling apple orchards of Normandy, Somerset, or Brittany each autumn, trees heavy with crimson, gold, and emerald fruit. In 1280, the English crown issued the pre-sidricole decree, requiring every orchard owner to pay a portion of their cider as tax, underlining its importance as a commercial staple rather than a mere rustic brew. After harvest, apples were washed, crushed in wooden presses or stone mills, and the juice gently fermented in cool brick cellars. Weeks or months later, wild yeasts transformed sugar into a light wine of 4–6% ABV, bright, tart, and slightly spicy. A cup of this cider alongside bread and cheese was like drinking the very breath of the countryside. Cider threaded through daily life and seasonal rites across western England and northern France. Harvest festival gatherings always featured fresh-pressed cider. After ploughing or reaping, field hands would raise tankards to quench their thirst and celebrate the land's bounty. Villagers practiced wassailing on cold January night, singing blessings around the orchard, splashing cider, mixed with spices like ginger and clove onto the trees, hoping to banish evil spirits and coax a fruitful bloom. Yet historians still debate how widespread cider truly was. Some argue the royal tax confirms its ubiquity. Others counter that only apple-rich regions produce cider, while much of rural Europe simply drank fresh or diluted apple juice. Regardless, in cider country Somerset, Devon, Cornwall, Norman diet was as essential as bread itself. Standing alongside cider at high table was mead, the drink of aristocrats and abbots. The 1190 Mead Charter of Winchester allowed mead to be sold publicly only during the spring festival under episcopal patronage. Crafted from pure honey fermented with water and wild yeast, mead was aged in ceramic jars or oak barrels for a year or more. Honey in the Middle Ages was as valuable as gold. A single barrel of mead often cost several times more than a cask of cider. In Iberia, an entire village became known as the Shrine of Mead, supplying royal courts and cathedrals with its secret recipe wildflower honey infused with herbs like fennel, peony, and cinnamon bark, passed down for generations. The church embraced mead's perceived medicinal virtues. During Easter celebrations, small silver goblets of mead were raised with the vow, "Through this humble cup, we honor our ancestors," underscoring honey's sacred status as both healing balm and symbol of divine bounty. Monasteries kept mead on hand to restore weak brothers, for its sweetness, energy, and easy digestibility made it both a treat and a tonic. Still, scholars argue whether mead was confined to high society. One side insists its expense, and laborious brewing limited it to the elite. Another notes that many peasant families kept beehives, producing modest mead at home, especially in alpine valleys of Germany and Switzerland. Whatever the case, mead remained a mark of refinement, far from the common pottage pot. Both cider and mead were inseparable from medieval festivals and ceremonies. In Normandy's Pomona Day, villagers vied in a cider tasting contest. Those who correctly identified apple varieties won prized bottles. In England, the springtime mead festival featured dancing, minstrels, and communal toasts of honey wine. At noble weddings, a gilded goblet of mead often preceded the wedding cakeia ritual said to have comforted Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine on her wedding night, steadying her heart before a life of power. Each vintage bore its own character-smoky notes from orchard bonfires in one year, delicate floral hints of wild broom in another, ensuring every bottle told a unique story. Today's craft cider makers and mead masters in England, France, and across America endlessly debate apple cultivars, wild versus cultivated honey, and spontaneous versus cultured yeasts. Their passion underscores humanity's enduring desire to reclaim and reinterpret these ancient flavors. A medieval day on an estate might begin with a spiced mug of cider at dawn, followed by a midday repast with smoked meats and a draught of mead, and end beside the hearth with a final pour of aged honey wine as stories wove through the candlelight. Even now, amid our wide array of wines, whiskies, and cocktails, thousands delight in this sweet duo. Tasting rooms from New England's orchards to California's wine country offer Willamette Valley cider or lavender mead of Sonoma, inviting both elders who recall ancestral tastes and younger palates curious for the new old. Thus concludes item 10 in our roster of medieval survival fare, cider and mead, the noble sweets. Let the crisp tang of apple and the lush warmth of honey carry you into a world both pragmatic and poetic. Next we turn to item 11, secret weddings and daring elopements, where love and politics clash beneath orchard bowers and gilded chalices. After those tangy sips of cider and sweet, lingering mead, you can feel a warm glow spreading through your body. Now, prepare for the 11th dish, scraps and a fourth, peasant's treasure. This isn't glossy ribs or a tender sirloin, but liver, heart, lungs, intestines, and countless other byproducts, often overlooked, yet essential on the medieval rural table. During slaughter season, the farm owner divided the beast. The finest cuts went to nobles and honoured guests, while skin, bones, and offal were left for the labourers and butchers. In 1351, the Statute of Westminster legally required that livers and intestines be handed over to the workers, ensuring they wouldn't go hungry. Thanks to this, peasants had the raw materials to make a nourishing stew, supplying energy for a hard day in the fields. Picture a large cauldron set over a wood-fired clay hearth, steam swirling upward, beef liver sliced into small pieces, pig's heart cut into thin strips, sheep lungs torn into bite-sized chunks all thrown in with wild greens, collard leaves, amaranth, small garden turnips, rings of onion and herbs gathered from field margin-thyme, oregano, and the like. A handful of coarse salt or sea salt, plus a spoonful of dark rye flour to thicken the broth. You'd hear the soft hiss of steam as the rich scent of liver mingled with herbal aromas, turning heads even from the village path. To remove any gamey odour, they'd rinse the offal in apple cider vinegar, then blanch it quickly in boiling water, a method that both removed toxins and tenderized the meat. The rural medical compendium even includes a remedy: cooking goat intestines in cider with a dash of fresh garlic to treat rheumatism and stiff joints. These folk remedies show that offal was valued not just for sustenance, but also for healing. A local legend in Brittany tells of a pig's offal festival held on the last day of slaughter season. After parboiling the intestines, villagers would marinate them in herbs, then hang them on a special rack called the ceremonial curtain. The lord and the village elder would taste first, judge their quality, then distribute the choicest pieces to the poorest families. Drums and horns echoed through the village as the fragrant aroma of boiled offal filled the aira, strange but heartfelt communal ritual. Nutritionally, liver and intestines are rich in vitamin A, heme iron, and B12 nutrients scarce in a vegetable-based diet. During brutal winters, when vitamin deficiencies and anemia threatened, a kettle of offal stew kept labourers from collapsing from weakness. Yet modern historians and medical experts still debate whether long-term offal consumption accumulated heavy metal toxins from the environment. Some studies warn that liver, being the body's detox organ, can harbour pollutants, while others insist its superior nutrition outweighed any risks, helping people endure cold and hunger. Offal also found non-culinary uses. In some rural English areas, boiled pig intestines were dried until crisp and used to seal cracks in earthen walls or patch worn leather boots. Locals called this practice intestine plaster, enough to repel rainwater from earthen walls. Such ingenuity illustrates the medieval peasants' waste-nothing philosophy. This way of life teaches us that even what's deemed discardable can become a precious resource. A simple dinner in a thatch-roofed cottage might be a bowl of liver and lung stew, a few slices of cold rye bread, and a cup of thin cider. The crackle of conversation around the hearth and the comforting aroma of offal stew can make the cold outside feel worlds away. Now, when you hear about scraps and a falther, peasant's treasure, imagine tender morsels of liver, rich pig intestines, and a steaming pot fragrant with herbs. This is a testament to boundless creativity, turning what seemed worthless into life, sustaining strength. And after pottage, bread, gruel, turnips, and mead, offal remains the ultimate symbol that medieval people never surrendered hope, even amid hunger and hardship. After gorging on offal and scraps, the final resource that medieval village communities turned to was the ancient forest. Dish number 12 in our survival food series is wild plants, nature's gift. Imagine a late winter morning when the last of the snow has melted at the field's edge and the gardens lie bare. The grain stores are empty, and turnips have frozen solid on the yard's surface. There's only one path left, into the deep woods. Farmers set out with woven baskets and small knives, silently gathering whatever life the land still offers. Wild asparagus shoots, fat hen greens, young moringa sprouts, mountain watercress, wood ear mushrooms, pine mushrooms, any hint of green is harvested. Everything is rinsed in the stream, chopped into chunks, and thrown into a pot of pottage to boost flavour or simmered on its own with a pinch of coarse salt. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 drove many villages to desperation, forcing them to organise collective mushroom hunts. They formed teams. The experienced foragers who could identify safe species led the way, while novices followed behind to collect. Every basket of mushrooms represented hope for supper. A single mistake could spell tragedy, sending villagers limping to the monastery infirmary for urgent care. In Western England, a tradition called ghost mushroom hunting persisted. Certain mushrooms with a pungent, leathery odour were believed to repel evil spirits. Locals would place caps under their beds or carry them in pouches, confident that malevolent forces would give them a wide berth. Afterward, the mushrooms, though somewhat dry in taste, were thoroughly cleaned, trimmed, and added to mild stews, prized as a forest elixir, packed with nutrients. Scholars still debate the safety of this practice. Proponents assert that generations of hands-on experience recognizing species by cap color, scent, and season created an incredibly sophisticated indigenous knowledge system. Critics counter that without written guides or formal classification, a single poisonous species like the death cap, Amanita phalloides, slipping into the harvest could cause mass poisoning. Records do exist of a parishioner hospitalized after eating death caps, prompting the entire village to plead with the monastery for emergency treatment. Beyond mushrooms, a host of other wild plants played a vital role in survival. In early spring, wild asparagus emerges through the leaf litter tender, white-tipped shoots that taste both sweet and slightly bitter. Foragers learn to pick only the youngest spears, no longer than a finger, to avoid the tough, woody sections that can wreak havoc on digestion. Along stream banks, mountain watercress, fat hen, and wild parsley added a refreshing note to pottage's muddy broth. In many regions, local customary law recognized villagers' gathering rights. Even on a lord's woodland, peasants could collect fallen fruit and wild herbs. 14th century court rolls often record disputes not over grazing livestock, but over the right to pick leaves, hunt mushrooms, or harvest riverside greens. Offenders risked losing their foraging knives or being sentenced to days of unpaid labor. A lesser-known custom survived in Lorraine, France, the forest procession. On the last day of winter, villagers would set out in baskets to collect mushrooms and fallen leaves on the hillside, then hold a forest welcome ceremony around the village. They scattered dry twigs and leaves along the lanes, recited prayers asking the woods to continue providing nourishment, and then shared their mushrooms and shoots in a communal soup. The ritual blended spirituality with practicality, treating the forest as both ally and larder. Nutritionally, these wild greens supplied vitamins and minerals long exhausted from home gardens. Forest mushrooms delivered plant-based protein and amino acids. Traditional healers also used many of these plants as medicine, brewing oak bark decoctions to treat diarrhea, or crushing nettle leaves into poultices to disinfect wounds. Such folk remedies undoubtedly helped villagers survive mild poisonings, as nature's pharmacy often provided an antidote in time. Despite the risks, foraging for wild plants remained a cornerstone of survival, underscoring the deep bond between humans and nature in the Middle Ages. Every basket of mushrooms, every bundle of wild greens was more than a meal, it was generational wisdom passed down, a cultural legacy of the rural community. After filling up on offal and scraps, the very last resource medieval villages turned to was the deep forest. Dish number 13 in our survival food series is wild nuts, nature's hardtack. When autumn arrives and leaves drift down like golden snow, villagers head to the hillsides and ancient oaks to gather nuts. Chestnuts encased in prickly bursa prized, because they can be roasted and eaten immediately or dried for later. In 1280, the king imposed a chestnut tax in southern France, requiring every landowner to surrender a portion of their harvest to the crown, declaring chestnuts a valuable economic commodity. Thus, chestnuts became one of the earliest traded goods in rural Europe. But chestnuts weren't the only game in the woods. Villagers also collected acorns from venerable oaks once their husks had fallen. These were washed, dried, or ground into fleur-bitter yet filling. Acorn meal was blended into rye bread to stretch precious grain, or stirred into pottage for extra thickness. Hazelnuts, smaller and harder to find, were shelled, dried, and pulverized into a fine meal, then mixed into thin gruels to take the sting out of plain oats. Here's a little-known detail. In the Auvergne region, every early autumn the entire village held a chestnut fair, much like an agricultural show. Families proudly displayed their harvests, swapped early ripening chestnut varieties for sweeter ones, and taught one another how to dry, roast, and store their bounty. Laughter and bargaining filled the valley, turning nut gathering into a brief communal celebration amid the harvest. Yet historians still debate the true importance of these forest nuts. One camp insists that when pottage grew bland, bread ran out, and gruel was too thin, chestnuts and acorn flour provided the most reliable calories to extend lives through lean seasons. They point to records from the Abbey of Cluny showing monks were allotted 2 handfuls of chestnuts each day in winter to ward off hypoglycemia. The opposing view argues that the astringent taste and digestibility issues of raw acorn meal relegated nuts to a last resort option, not a staple. They cite medical reports of the era documenting cases of severe stomach upset when acorn meal was eaten without proper leaching. In practice, forest nuts were never as palatable as garden crops, but they were powerhouses of nutrition. Savvy villagers knew to soak ground acorn meal in clean water for days to leach out bitter tannins, then dry it again. Acorn flour treated this way added a mild, nutty warmth to pottage instead of harsh bitterness. Roasting chestnuts over coals cracked their shells, releasing a caramel-like sweetness that both elders and children savor either as a snack or sprinkled into stews. Hazelnuts earned the nickname soft gold. People made hazel cakes akin to modern cookies by mixing hazelnut meal with a little honey, forming small patties and drying them in the sun. These hard, portable cakes could last for weeks in leather pouches, serving as emergency rations for long journeys or quick pick-me-ups for children helping in the fields. Nutritionally, 100 g of chestnuts supply around 450 kilocalories, acorn flour about 300 kilocalories, and hazelnuts up to 600 kilocalories thanks to their high oil content. That means just a few handfuls of forest nuts could stave off cold, preserve warmth, and boost energy, true superfoods when all else was scarce. A single harvest could feed a family for several days. Of course, gathering nuts depended on the weather and season. Wet autumns risked chestnuts spoiling before they fell, and improperly leached acorns could mold. Families scrambled for sunny spells to collect and dry their find. Poor harvests forced communities to ration every nut. Some households might go home empty-handed. Yet despite these challenges, wild nuts proved vital to medieval survival and showcased rural ingenuity, making the most of whatever the forest offered. Every time villagers roasted chestnuts by the hearth, mixed leached acorn meal into pottage, or crunched through dried hazelnuts, they preserved the flavors and traditions of resilience. So even after pottage, rye bread, thin gruels, hardy roots, rich offal, wild plants, and sweet meads have passed, forest nuts still stand by nature's hardtack, an invaluable gift from towering trees that kept countless ancestors alive through the harshest seasons. After filling up on wild nuts, nature's own hardtack, the next resource medieval peasants turned to was the rare sweetness of honey and wild berries. Honey and wild berries, the sweetness of hope, is the 14th survival food in our list of 15. Picture stretches of wildflowers along stream banks, where honeybees flit among the blossoms, and scattered patches of wild strawberries ripening under oak canopies. While cane sugar remained a luxury reserved for nobles and the church, the poor found a way to taste sweetness, by keeping a few stray hives in monastery gardens or hollow tree trunks, and by foraging for those tiny red fruits in the woods. As early as 1190, the monks of Winchester Abbey issued the Charter of the Bees, granting themselves the right to expand beekeeping and sell honey to fund repairs and buy sacred manuscripts. Honey was prized as liquid gold. A spoonful stirred into a cup of mint, rosemary, or chamomile tea not only soothed sore throats but also killed germs. Drizzling honey into bland pottage, or thin gruel, instantly transformed it into a dish with soul and warmth. Wild strawberries, called strawberry guerdin by Gaelic speakers, were plucked at peak ripeness as a festive treat for children and elders alike. Eaten fresh or lightly stewed with a bit of honey to make a humble jam, they lent a gentle aroma and bright, tangy sweetness to stale bread. Even a coarse spoonful of berry honey preserves alongside a hunk of cold black bread could spark a moment of joy in lean times. A curious local legend survives from Tyrol in the Alps. Villagers believed that honey harvested on a full moon night carried a special spirit-banishing power. They would gather beneath wildflower-laden trees, whisper a few blessings, then draw honey from the hives by torchlight, convinced that moonlit honey would warm the body and clear the mind. Yet food historians and scientists still debate honey's true shelf life and purity. Proponents point out that honey's high sugar content and trace enzymes like glucose oxidase naturally inhibit microbial growth, preserving taste, color, and nutrients for years. Critics warn that primitive extraction methods, dirty knives, smoke-filled cottages could introduce contaminants, diminish quality, or even cause digestive upset. Regardless of the debate, honey and wild berries remained indispensable spiritual medicine. In the long droughts and famines, a single spoonful of sweet honey or a handful of wild strawberries could banish fatigue and kindle hope for tomorrow. It offered not only quick calories but also a reminder that, even in the harshest winters or droughts, nature still provided life's sweetest gifts. After sampling so many survival staples of the Middle Ages, we arrive at the final secret, the art of whatever's in the pot. When winter's chill cuts to the bone and storerooms stand empty, peasants had no choice but to toss every scrap they had into a single cauldron. Imagine a late winter afternoon in 1339 at Cressy Village, England. Royal officials arrive bearing crates of mysterious provisions, slightly mouldy barley, a handful of shriveled turnips, rock-hard bread, scraps of meat and offal for each poor household. A royal decree sternly instructs, use it all, waste nothing. Those mixed ingredients go into a large iron pot, simmer for hours, then get ladled out to every family. Thus was born the officially recorded hodgepodge stew, a testament to desperation-driven creativity. Legend has it that in Capua, Italy, villagers held an annual chaos pottage contest at the very end of winter. Each household brought a basket of odds and ends, perhaps some tree bark, bruised apples, crushed hazelnut shells, and soaked bread scrap sand cooked them together. Judges awarded the pot that was neither too fishy nor burnt nor gloppy, with a sack of fresh grain and a small pot of honey. The contest not only provided entertainment and a chance to share recipes, but also cemented the use what you have ethos in folk memory. Modern historians still debate whether these hodgepodge stews were a brutal measure of last resort or the precursors to today's zero waste and nose-to-tail culinary movements. Some argue they prove medieval people mastered resourcefulness. Others see them as grim reminders of poverty, forcing folks to swallow odd mixtures to survive. Whatever the interpretation, the art of whatever's in the pot brings our medieval food journey to a close with a timeless lesson. In the harshest circumstances, humans do not merely endure, they innovate, turning scarcity into sustenance. Today, as we face abundance yet waste so much, that spirit of making do has never been more relevant. When we look back on the harsh culinary journey of the medieval world, we see that each dish did more than simply sustain life. It contained a treasury of ingenuity, local knowledge, and an unbroken communal spirit in the face of famine, cold, and hardship. It all begins with pottage, the everlasting pot, simmering over a clay hearth where peasants ladled out a thick gruel of rye, oats, or barley blended with turnips, onions, cabbage, and whatever wild greens they could scavenge. Pottage embodied the principle of waste nothing. Any stray sprig of watercress from the ditch, a lone carrot from the garden, even discarded bean pods could find their way into the pot, producing a rich, savoury herbal umami. Next came the hefty slice of black bread, dunked quickly into pottage or a mug of weak ale, forming the framework of the meal and keeping body and spirit from collapsing in hunger. Imagine the earthy aroma of whole grains, the scorched crust shaved away to expose a warm, malty crumb, then dipped into ale with a satisfying hiss. That black bread, rock hard though it might be, provided over 60% of a labourer's daily calories. When pottage and bread ran low, medieval cooks turned to gruel, a thin porridge made from just a few spoonfuls of grain and 3 times as much water. Gruel wasn't meant to delight, only to sustain enough to buy you another day. In the harshest months, monastery novices were sometimes put on a 3-day gruel fast as a test of endurance, a purifying trial of body and mind. Then the humble root vegetables took centre stage. Turnips and rutabagas, bulging beneath cracked, impoverished soil. Every autumn, villagers would proudly display their fattest roots, stewing them with coarse salt and a scrap of pork fat until they became a wintertime favourite. In Brittany, they even held turnip festivals, dancing around patches of turnips and boiling them into a simple syrupy drink. Nourishing and warming, these roots saved countless lives from starvation. We must also mention cabbage and onions, the pungent yet priceless duo. Fermented cabbage, the predecessor of sauerkraut, preserved vitamin C for winter diets deprived of fresh greens. Onions, sharp as they were, served as a folk remedy for colds, and were even tucked into shoes for warmth. Though at one time church councils banned cabbage on feast days to maintain decorum, sauerkraut remained the divine condiment of rural kitchens. Protein came largely from peas, lentils, and beans, the medieval meat substitutes. When church law forbade flesh on certain holy days, mashed pulses provided vital sustenance for millions. In Champagne, they even held pea-grinding contests, pitting young men and women against each other to see who could produce the smoothest pea machan. The winner earned the right to a private harvest, festival rendezvous. During the Great Famine of 1317, when only ash remained in hearths, desperate souls mixed scraps of stale bread, leftover grains, and even dried bark into ash cakes. Dusty shells of coarse flour pressed with water and baked in embers. They offered just enough bulk to keep a jaw from breaking and a heart from giving up. At sea, salted herring from the Baltic and North Seas became medieval fast food. Oak barrels packed alternately layer by layer with fish and salt under the aegis of the Hanseatic League found their way inland by river and road. A salty fillet dipped in vinegar, or briefly steeped in cheap wine, then eaten with a slice of heavy rye bread, became the quick, on-the-run meal of masons, blacksmiths, and fasting monks. Through it all, the immortal pairing of ale and bread accompanied every meal. Small ale, just 1.3% ABV, boiled off waterborne bacteria, and even served as a toddler's beverage, or, in southern Germany, as a bath to protect skin. Bread dunked in ale would hiss and soften, releasing malt and yeast aromas, fueling labour at dawn. After that mug of ale came the sweet interlude of cider and mead. Sharp, ferment-kissed cider from Normandy orchards once paid the crown's cider tithe, while honey mead, champion of the nobles and the church, was aged in oak barrels and served at royal weddings. Cider carried the countryside in each sip. Mead carried the prestige of ancestral honey, a liquid dowry. When fresh meat was scarce, offal and organ meat slivers, hearts, lungs, tripe became the peasant's secret treasure. A hearty stew of offal, wild greens, and dark rye flour delivered iron and vitamin A through bitter winters. In Brittany, even the Pig's Gut Festival celebrated these humble cuts. Organs boiled with herbs, displayed on ceremonial racks, and then portioned out to the needy. The deep woods yielded their gifts too. Chanterelles, fat hens, wild asparagus, and other foraged greens became the forest's bounty. Organized mushroom hunts, complete with guides versed in local lore, balanced on a knife edge between nourishment and poisonous mistake. Yet they persisted, gathering essence of the forest into their pottage. When fields lay fallow and storehouses were barren, forest nutchnuts, acorns, hazelnuts became nature's hardtack. Dried whole or ground into flour, they stretched pottage, bread, or gruel into the lean months. In Auvergne, an autumn chestnut fair saw villagers trading seed stock and drying tips as if running a primitive agricultural expo. Wild berries and honey lent a rare sweetness, the sweetness of hope, to otherwise stark diets. Under the 1190 Charter of the Bees, monasteries raised hives, sold honey to fund upkeep, and used the golden syrup to sweeten herbal teas, syrups, or even pottage. Wild strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, eaten fresh or turned into primitive preserves, brought moments of delight to weary souls. Finally, when all else failed, medieval cooks mastered the whatever's in the pot ethos, mixing stale bread, odds and ends of vegetables, leftover offal, forest nuts, and dried herbs into a hodgepodge stew. In 1339, the Crown of England formally rationed mixed provisions to the poor of Cressy, recognizing this stew as an official survival strategy. In Capua, Italy, a winter mishmash porridge contest challenged villagers to transform chaos into culinary art. From the billowing steam of pottage to the discordant charm of the hodgepodge, the 15 foods of the Middle Ages tell a story of extraordinary resilience, folk wisdom, local know-how, communal sharing, and an unquenchable spark of hope. Despite scarcity and hardship, our medieval forebears found joy in turnip festivals, shared mugs of honey mead, and spun tales by flickering torchlight. They lived by balancing grains, wild greens, legumes, and offal, by choosing safe brews over dirty water, by stealing sweetness from honey and berries, and above all, by unleashing boundless creativity when every resource ran low. Today, with more food choices than anyone could ask for, the medieval menu reminds us that in the face of adversity, Human beings will always find ways to use every resource, pass on hard-won knowledge, and hold fast to hope. Every bowl of pottage, slice of bread, spoonful of gruel, or basket of foraged mushrooms stands as testament to a people's refusal to surrender. They did not eat merely to exist, they ate to preserve identity, hold on to memory, and strengthen their bonds of community, a lesson as vital now as it was 1,000 years ago.